All right, good afternoon, everybody. This is David Henry, and welcome to course 7 and 8 of the Mediation Mastery Series. Today we have two topics. We're going to be mediating with multiple parties and insurers, and then we're going to deal with mediation with not-for-profits, which includes, for example, governmental entities and HOAs and folks like that. I like these two topics. You'll see some commonalities and some similarities in approach. I think the good news is that these are teachable topics in the sense that, beg your pardon there, in the sense that we need to do some things differently, and we need to sometimes do things that are a little counterintuitive. Some of our natural trial strategies don't work so well when we're dealing with multiple parties, multiple defendants, and multiple insurers or not-for-profits. And I think some of those concepts will become clear as we get into the material. So we covered in prior sessions attendance and authority and importance of mediation statements and opening. And so now we're sort of moving temporally toward the actual mediation. In this case, we got a mediation with multiple defendants. It might be a construction case. It might be a premises case. It might be some sort of professional liability. Whatever it is, if there's multiple defendants, the first thing you have to appreciate if you're a defendant in one of these cases is that you have to work very hard to make sure that everybody's in agreement on what you're trying to do. You have to get a consensus. And this is, well, let's say that's obvious, David. Well, yeah, but during the course of litigation, when you're working on all the litigation things, the discovery, the paper discovery, the depots, the motion practice, etc., you don't typically spend a whole lot of time with your defendants talking about how we're going to get this case settled. What do you think your proportional share is? What's your coverage situation? And do you have coverage? Why don't you have coverage? Do you have coverage problems? We don't spend a whole lot of time thinking about all these issues because we're so immersed in the mechanics of the machinery of litigation that we forget that sort of step back and ask the big picture. Now, if it's just you and one other plaintiff, it's a lot easier because it's a zero-sum game and every dollar you put in the pot goes to the plaintiff and you just got to ring the bell and get to the right number. In a multi-defendant case, frequently you're not going to be able to get out on your own. If you do, you pay a premium for that. So you've got to get all these other folks into the settlement pot, into the settlement posture, and they may not be there for a variety of reasons. They may not be inclined to settle. They may not be in a position where they want to. They may not have a lot of funds. There's a host of problems that are created when you have multiple defendants. And the thing you have to remember is you're not just adding one party, you're adding multiple decision makers because that other defendant is going to have a client, a lawyer, maybe a carrier, maybe an in-house counsel, maybe there's coverage counsel. There could be 3, 4, 5 other bodies associated with that other party that have to agree on what they're going to do at mediation. And so when you go from 2, 3, 4, 5 parties, you're not just, it's not arithmetic. It's not what plus 1, plus 1, plus 1. It's like 3, 6, 9, 12, 15 decision makers. So you're putting a whole lot of extra people in the room in a multi-party case. And it's very important if you're a defendant in a multi-party, multi-defendant case that you work extraordinarily hard to ensure that everybody else in the coming to the mediation knows their liability, knows their exposure, and is prepared to contribute. And you have to flush out those who aren't. You have to flush out those who aren't. And there are sometimes some no-pay defendants, and we'll talk about that in a minute. So the biggest impediment to resolving a multi-party, multi-defendant case, whether it's construction, securities case, it's a transportation problem, it's a whatever you're dealing with. The biggest problem, the biggest impediment is the defense itself. There's a number the plaintiff will take. It's getting everybody in the room. It's the lack of intra-defendant planning. And I know this because that's what I did for 30 years. I was a defense attorney for almost all my career with a couple, side trips. But for the most part, I did. And I did all times I had transportation cases, I had construction cases where there were 3 or 4 different defendants in the case. And we all had to be sort of marching in line towards settlement, because if somebody doesn't want to settle or someone doesn't want to pay or someone thinks their exposure is de minimis, you got a big problem and you got to work on. And so there's a lot more time that needs to get spent by you as a defense attorney. Don't assume the other parties know their exposure. I can't stress this enough. I can't tell you how many times I've gone to mediation when I was a younger lawyer and I didn't know what the other side was going to do. Well, the first thing you want to know is what are they going to do? What is the first thing they're going to say in mediation? What's the opening caucus going to look like? The first defense caucus You need to think like that. In fact, you need to have a defense caucus before the mediation even starts. You need to go into have a caucus, do it within the ambit of the mediation privilege, get all the defense counsel together, and necessarily even the insurers. And some of them are going to want to do it. I know this. I know this because they're not trained to do that. They don't think like that. They don't think collegially. They don't think collaboratively like that. It's just not what they're, and there's nothing in the rule book that tells them that. There's not, the carrier's not telling them to schedule a meeting with the, shame on the carriers. Shame on the carriers. The carriers don't coordinate intra-carrier meetings. I can't tell you how many times as a defendant, at the end of my career, when the light kind of went on, I realized I got to make this happen. No one else is going to do it. I would start calling around to set up an intra-defendant meeting, and folks would go, no, we don't want to do that. Well, why wouldn't you want to do that? Wouldn't you want to know where everybody's going to be at? Wouldn't you want to know who's bringing what to the party? I mean, why wouldn't you want more information? You mediate better with more information, not less, right? So the whole concept of this sort of this institutionalized ignorance that takes place sometimes amongst defense attorneys, not always, but I saw it so many times. It was the same movie over and over and over again. And then as a mediator, I would get all the defendants in a room, and I go, okay, you know, what do we do? What's our opening offer look like? And they can't even agree among themselves on what the opening offer is going to look like, because somebody thinks that, you know, the other side should eat 50%, and Mr. 50% thinks he should only be in for a third. And there's one guy that thinks he should be in for nothing. And then there's another lady who thinks she should be in for like 10%. We think she should be like half. And we can't even get an offer off the ground because there's so much interdefendant squabbling. And you say, well, Dave, what can I do to avoid that? Well, at least you can know, you have to know it's coming. And then if you see that in the eyes, you know, the mind's eye of reason, you don't think that they're paying their adequate share, they're not prepared to make an appropriate contribution, you got to work that problem. But the first thing to do is identify that you have a problem. There's somebody here who doesn't understand their exposure, not willing to pay. Maybe they got coverage problems. And then in the next session, the last of our series, we're going to cover Covalence and Toomey agreements, which are two specialized settlement agreements that deal with coverage problems. We're not going to deal with those today, right? So they have coverage problems. Well, do they really have coverage problems, or are they feigned coverage problems? The carrier really does have pretty significant exposure, but they're using coverage as a smokescreen to keep their contribution down. And you might have to be able to push back on that. So I want to know, before I go into mediation, what do I think everyone's pretty much going to do? So when I come to the first caucus, I've got a pretty good idea of what everyone's going to do. I may not like it, but at least I've planned for it. And most importantly, if you're a defense attorney, you've reported it. You've made it clear to the client or the carrier, hey, this is what I think defendant X is going to do, and this is what defendant Y is going to say. And they love that. The clients don't mind so much if the thing doesn't, if it doesn't get settled because the other parties aren't putting in their fair share, because you can only control what you can do. But what clients really don't like, and what carriers really don't like, are surprises. So if they know it's coming, if they know, if you're representing, you know, carrier A, and you know, you're CNA, and you know Zurich's going to be a problem, or, you know, One Beacon's going to be a problem, or whoever's going to be a problem, you know, you tell the carrier, and you tell your client in advance in your suit report, hey, we're having a problem getting contribution from this co-defendant. Expect them to say this, this, and this. And you put that in your suit report, and guess what happens? That's what happens. They love that. They love when you say something in the report and you're clairvoyant and you're predictive. That makes them feel good about the process. So knowing what the first caucus is going to be like, and the way you do that is to try to schedule one in advance, with or without the mediator. And they'll say no because they don't know any better. You know, well, no one ever asked us to do this. Right. It's just unexamined habit and ritual. There's no good reason not to. What's the compelling reason not to? There isn't really a good one. There's bad reasons not to, like I'm too busy, or I don't care, I don't want to know. But if they're not cooperating in the scheduling of a pre-mediation conference, that should be a red flag that they may not have, they may not be interested in contributing at all. Because if they have significant exposure, I think they might be interested in coming to the conference and talking about it and seeing if they can get contributions. So it might be another indicator that they don't have their act together. They haven't evaluated it correctly. Defense counsel doesn't want to go to that meeting because he or she doesn't have their act together and doesn't know what the arguments are going to be. And they're scared about that, and they're insecure about their position. So then what you can sometimes do is suggest that you do an intra-defendant meeting of the carriers. So if there's just carriers or there's just in-house counsel, you say, well, let's just set up a meeting for in-house counsel for the carriers, the adjusters, to get together and chat amongst themselves without the lawyers. And sometimes the carriers will appreciate that. Certainly your client, if you're an insurance defense lawyer, your client will appreciate that effort. That's what you're trying to show is effort. You're trying to show, I am an advocate for resolution. I'm trying to work the problem. I'm trying to make something intelligent happen here. That's sort of the key to the whole thing, right? If you can do that, then you get bonus points in the eyes of your client. Your client won't fault you for an impasse if you've shown that you've tried to work the problem and the other defendants just aren't willing to do it. And I think that's really, really important because carriers like to see effort toward resolution. They're not interested in trials except as a last resort. So let's see. So what else can you do? Okay. So first thing you do is figure out who's going to say what and try to have an inter-defendant meeting. Schedule 2 mediations at the beginning of the case. In a big case with lots of parties, someone's going to have a change of heart. Someone's case is going to go bad. Someone's case is going to get better. Someone's case is going to go really bad, and someone's going to want another mediation. And the one that needs to mediate may not have the desire to ask for it because it may look like a sign of weakness. So I always believe in multi-party cases, you should schedule and plan for 2 mediations at the start of the case. The plaintiff's lawyer will thank you. The plaintiff's lawyer will probably not say no. Defense, and that way you get to an early mediation and then have one later in the case so that you if somebody has a change of heart or somebody's case, early in the case, maybe everyone's got too much, they're too much in love with their case and they think that they can't lose. They got too much motion practice they want to do. They think they got a shot at summary judgment. Okay, fine. So, but then after all those arrows are out of their quiver and they realize now they're staring down a trial, now you need to get into mediation, but nobody planned for a second one. So you got to be the smartest person in the room. That's the key to being a good mediation advocate in a multi-party case is don't rely on the co-defendants to be smart and to be proactive and to do the right thing because they won't. They're going to disappoint you. They're going to disappoint you. So you have to take the lead and let the mediator know what you're doing and let your client know what you're doing. Right? And the client's going to love it, and the mediator is going to love it because you're going to become a friend of the mediator. And currying favor with the mediator is never a bad thing. Showing the mediator that you're the one who's trying to put a deal together, you're going to be the mediator's favorite. He or she's not going to bang on you for more money. They're going to go bang on somebody else for more money. Right? Right. You're going to create equity in the relationship with the mediator, which is pretty important. The other thing you got to do is make sure you understand what the insurance coverage is for the co-defendants. Who's got coverage? What are the limits? What are the SIRs or the deductibles? If there's some coverage exclusions that are a big deal, figure out what those are and figure out whether you believe it or not. Sometimes I've had to help out unsophisticated defendants understand that the coverage position that the carrier was taking was hoo-ha. They're still going to pay. They have a duty to defend. They're not going to go litigate their coverage position. There's not enough money at stake to litigate their coverage position. They're not going to file a deck action and spend $150,000 on a case they can settle for $150,000. So the coverage position is kind of hoo-ha, right? And so sometimes you got to help your co-defendant push back against his own carrier, right? Because they don't know, they don't have the expertise. I mean, I have expertise in insurance coverage, so it's easier for me because I did CGL work for a long time and I taught CGL. So if you're not an expert in insurance coverage, start taking some insurance seminars. If you're going to do insurance defense in a significant, meaningful way, and you're going to be in complex, high exposure cases where there's multiple parties with multiple policies, you sure got to get good at reading policies. That's just part of it. I don't know how you can practice well in mediation if you don't understand the coverage implications of what you're doing and when coverage is not there and when it is there, and understand how to push back on carrier positions that are contrary to what you're trying to accomplish. So have a chart and then do a little chart. I used to have a little spreadsheet, just a little chart. Defendant, their insurer, the policy term, and the key coverage provisions, and the SIR deductibles, if there's excess, who the claims, and I just have a chart. And so when I came into mediation, I knew what everybody had. I knew what everybody had going into mediation. And if somebody I thought, I've been in mediations where I thought someone should have had coverage and they hadn't notified their carrier, or they said, well, we notified the carrier and they denied coverage. Well, let me see the denial letter because I'm going to help you push back. If there's pushback potential, sometimes carriers get it wrong. I've been in multiple cases where I had a co-defendant, for example, in a defamation case. Well, I know there's coverage for defamation. under coverage Part B of the CGL policy. Now there's uncovered counts in the complaint, but there's a defamation count in the complaint. Well, that's going to trigger a duty to defend for sure. For sure, under any standard general liability policy, there's going to be coverage for defamation, unless you got some weird endorsement, and that gets us to a to-me problem, which we'll talk about in the next section. But I always knew what the coverage was for everybody when they showed up. I spent a little time working that problem, so there was no big mysteries about that. And if somebody didn't have coverage and I thought they should, I would help them investigate that, and we would get to the bottom of that. And sometimes I was able to get coverage for somebody else, which made it easier for my client to settle the case. Now, I got to get permission from my carrier when I start doing that kind of work, because sometimes some carriers don't want you spending tons and tons of time investigating somebody else's coverage. But if you tell them why you're doing it, hey, if I can get coverage for this guy, they're going to bring more money to the table. It's going to reduce our indemnity exposure. Most time, 99 times out of 100, the carrier go, that makes sense. Go do that, right? Go do that. Go find out what the coverage is for these other folks and make sure we know it's there. Okay. And then, of course, you're going to have a chart of who's coming. So you're going to, in the same chart, we talked about this last time. We said, find out who's coming in advance. Don't let there be any surprises about who's coming to mediation. If you're a plaintiff's attorney and you're plaintiffing a multi-defendant case, you got more work to do for sure, because you got to make sure that one of those defense lawyers is your friend, and one of those defense lawyers is sort of herding the corral, right? One of those defense lawyers has to be a shepherd for you, has to get all those cats together. And so you need to pick a friend, you need to pick a leader, you need to pick think of it like a jury foreman. Who's going to be who do you trust on the other side to kind of collectively herd the cats? And so you should have a good relationship with defense counsel. At least one of them. Say, hey, I need some help here getting this thing resolved. What can we do? And hopefully you get a friendly ear with one of those defense lawyers. If you don't, then you got to work extra hard to make sure all the defendants feel a little bit of pain. If you're a plaintiff and you've ignored one of the defendants or two of the defendants for most of the case, and you show up at mediation, you're going to find yourself in a bad way, because you're going to say, well, why aren't they all contributing? Because you haven't done anything in the last 6 months to make it look like defendant B and C have any real exposure. A sees it, A wants to pay money, but A's looking for help. Abel's looking for help from Baker and Carr, and Baker and Carr don't see any exposure because you haven't done anything to make them feel any pain. So what I would sometimes do when I was a defense attorney is I would call the plaintiff's attorney. If I had that defense meeting and I wasn't liking what I was hearing from my co-defendants, they didn't seem like they were prepared to pay, I would tell the plaintiff's attorney that information. I would say, I don't think B and C are going to bring much money to the mediation, and I think that's going to be a problem for you. And the plaintiff's attorney is going to thank you for that information, because defense lawyers don't normally act that way. So you got to act differently. Your instinct would be not to tell the plaintiff anything. But what you want to do is tell the plaintiff, we have a problem settling this case, but it's not me. It's them. Being a tattletale in this situation is okay. Trust me. You're currying favor with the plaintiff's attorney, because you've now given him or her a heads up. Hey, and you're calling them not the day before mediation. You're calling them 2 or 3 weeks before the mediation, because you had a meeting with the other defendants 3 or 4 weeks before the mediation, and you already know what the writing on the wall is, and it's not good. So you call the plaintiff's attorney and you say, look, I'm trying to get a deal done here. I think we're going to have a problem, and here's the problem. It's this guy or that lady or this carrier or whatever it is. And then the plaintiff's attorney is going to thank you for the information, and then they're going to ask you one question. Well, what do I do? What do I do? Thanks for what do I do? I go, well, I always say you got to put some fire ants in their picnic. They want a picnic at mediation, and you got to put some fire ants in their basket. So what could you do? Well, did you get the responses to discovery? No. Well, why didn't you move to compel? Well, because he had other things going on. It wasn't a big deal. Well, you need to file your motion to compel, get a hearing. Did you set a 30B6 corporate rep depot of their person? No. Well, what thing? And then said, you want me to draft you a 30B6? Because here's the questions that I would ask the other defendant if I was going to ask all the questions. And they go, no one's ever done that for me before. Well, I'm going to do it for you. I'm going to give you 15, 20 categories of things I think you should ask, and put that, you can cut and paste it and put it in your own 30B6 deposition notice, and you're going to ask the questions. But these are the things I would want to know. Right. You're doing some work for the plaintiff's attorney. He doesn't want to sit there and draft. He doesn't get paid, he or she doesn't get paid by the hour to draft discovery, but you do. So I'm going to give him a 30B6 depot notice. He can file, and he's going to start poking the other defendant, set the deposition for 2 days after the mediation. I love that, because then the mediator can say, well, what happens if we don't settle? Oh, Mr. Co-defendant, you're up for deposition for 2 days in Montana. Okay, great. Well, maybe we got to think about trying to settle this case, or do you really want to be deposed? So you can do some, you got to rattle the cage. You got to make them feel uncomfortable. You got to make them spend some money. You got to apply pressure and pain. I mean, professionally, nicely, but you know what I mean? I'm being a little, a little bit facetious when I say pain, but I mean, yeah, inflict economic pain, get someone's attention, make them work the file. Okay, that's pretty important. That's if you're a plaintiff. Now, if you're a defendant, so you want to, if you're a defendant, you want to use the mediator to your advantage. Don't be the first to leave. I'm never the first to leave in a multi-party case. Why do I want to be the first to leave? I don't like the numbers, but I'm not leaving. Make the plaintiff leave. Why would I ever leave? I get paid by the hour to settle cases. I'm not leaving. Plaintiff wants to leave, co-defendant wants to leave, fine. I'm not going to blow up this mediation. I'm here for the duration to try to get it done. Why would you ever be the first to leave in a multi-party case? Oh, we don't like what's going on. Okay, I don't like it either. But you show commitment to the process. The mediator then has to go work the other rooms. Okay. Why are this? And if we don't get the case settled, we got to start asking ourselves a bunch of questions. Why? Ask the mediator. Ask the plaintiff's attorney. Who's the problem? Who's not paying? Why aren't they paying? What's driving their settlement position? They just don't have the money because they don't have any insurance coverage. It's just a function of they don't have the funds. And how do we do a work around that problem? Okay. Or that carrier thinks for some reason they're going to get a cakewalk here. Sometimes that happens. You realize that. So in multi-defendant cases, what happens is sometimes you have parties who are willfully non-cooperative, meaning they know that the case needs to get settled. Somebody in that room needs to settle that case. And they know that if they don't put money in, someone else is likely to step up and make up the difference in a major way. And some carriers or clients just take that position. They just play that kind of what I call sort of back end game, where they're going to let everybody else. There's a void. They're going to create a void. They're going to create we need 50 grand or 100 grand more to settle this case. And they're purposely not going to put the money in because they assume the other defendants are collectively going to get there because they have to, because they have really bad cases. So I call it willful non-cooperation. They know exactly what they're doing. And sometimes they're willing to blow up a mediation. They're willing to blow up a mediation to play that end game. That's very frustrating. That's very frustrating. And there's not a whole lot you can do about it. If they're willing to blow up a mediation over relatively modest sum of money, because they assume other people will do it, they must have had some success with that strategy, or it goes horribly wrong. And then that comes back to, then if that's the party that's not cooperating, the plaintiff needs to focus their attention on that party and do some things to make them uncomfortable. Do some things to make them uncomfortable. Okay, maybe you need to amend your complaint to avoid some exclusions in the policy. You got to think real hard about what can we do that's going to make this defendant uncomfortable, right? And their carrier uncomfortable. So that this position, this sort of snarky, we're going to sit back and let you all figure it out. We got to change the dynamic on that so they're front and center. That's a harder problem. True, for sure. Definitely a harder problem. Okay, be mindful of the role of coverage counsel when you come to mediation in a multi-defendant case. What are they going to say? Why are they there? What are they bringing to the table? All right. Sometimes I want to know what that person's going to say. Sometimes they say things that are helpful. Sometimes they don't. Sometimes they alienate the plaintiff and the plaintiff's attorney. It makes it very hard to settle the case. I don't need them to say that. Sometimes I don't need them to say anything. They've said what they've already said in their position statement. It's already been reported to the mediator. I don't need to hear from the coverage counsel in the opening session. Sometimes I want to hear from coverage counsel because I like it when coverage counsel says, we don't, the claim that you're bringing, although we're defending, we really don't own any indemnity for this. And I love when the coverage counsel says that. But I want to know in advance what they're saying because I don't want them to queer my mediation with some reckless comment that ends up causing things to kind of spiral out of control. Okay. So that's a little bit on dealing with multiple defendants and multiple insurers. There's definitely a lot more work to be done. And the problem, of course, with mediation is we don't really have a rule for that. We don't have a established practice. And the established practice would be, and I have a mediation countdown that I use on my website. And I would encourage you to go there, and it's under the form section or the resources section. There's a mediation countdown, and the idea that we do things in a consistent way, in a planned way, and we put certain events on our calendar. We get our legal assistant, if we have one, or it's just you, get these phone calls, get these pre-mediation meetings on the calendar, schedule them, make it a priority. If you're on the defense side, you get paid for that. Why wouldn't you do it? Right? And get that pre-mediation statement out well in advance so that everybody sees the arguments, right? If you're going to take some shots at the co-defendants in the pre-mediation statement, that's fine. It's under the mediation privilege. Take your shots. Don't assume that the other co-defendants really understand their exposure. They may not, for a lot of reasons. You may have an inexperienced associate doesn't really know what they're doing. You may have a carrier that hasn't been paying attention to the file. You may have another insured who's been telling a bunch of nonsense to their own defense lawyer, and the defense lawyer doesn't know enough to disbelieve his own client. All sorts of things like that can happen. So getting a mediation statement out to everyone, not the mediator. I'm talking about to the plaintiff and the other co-defendants in advance. Here's how I see the case. Here's the issues that I see. Here's the problems that you have, plaintiff. Here's the problems you have, Mr. Co-defendant. Here's the problems you have. And make sure it gives us something to talk about. Because you want those other defendants talking to their people in advance of mediation. The worst thing that can happen is you have these mediations where some defense lawyer has been on vacation for 2 weeks and he drops into the mediation. That's a train wreck, because he or she hasn't been paying any attention to the file. They haven't had any communication with the carrier. The carrier's probably got a suit report that's 6 months old, bunch of old. They don't have any of the new information in the file. It's a mess. It's a mess. Beware of people who go on vacation for 2 weeks before mediation. That is usually a defendant is not well prepared for the mediation. Usually not well prepared. A couple other things I'll talk about when you have multiple defendant cases. So we go back to the problem of I can't get a deal on the table. I can't get everybody to agree on a contribution, a pro rata contribution at the beginning of the case. So I've got 4 defendants. And so as a mediator, I go, what do you say we just do a quarter? Well, of course, no one says this guy's got way more exposure. I don't hardly have any. At most, I should be in for like 5%. And we have this haggle that goes on for hours because we can't come to an agreement because nobody tried to work this out in advance. So then what I do is I do what I call monopoly money. So I go, guys, we all know it's going to take at least $1 million to settle this case. And all we're talking about is an opening offer of a couple $100,000, which we know has no chance of being accepted. Right? Right. Okay. So if we know that this offer isn't going to be accepted, then the proportional shares between the parties don't matter. Right? So let's just all agree we're going to make a collective offer of $200,000 so I can get in the room with the plaintiff's attorney, so the plaintiff's attorney is not sitting there for 3 or 4 hours with their face hanging out, with a client wondering what the hell is going on in the defense camp. And as they're growing more and more and more frustrated with the inability of the defense camp to come up with a single offer, which is going to make them very unhappy. I don't want that. So what can I do? Well, I just say, guys, let's just do monopoly money. It's fake money. No, he or she's not going to accept the offer. So we're just going to offer 200,000, and we'll do it. And if you want to say it's 25% apiece, but those percentages are not binding. Those percentages don't apply to any other future offers. And usually when I do that, everybody will agree, just to get it out there. No one's on the hook for anything because it's not going to be accepted. And I'll posture it in such a way so no one's on the hook for any percentage of it because it won't be accepted. It won't be. We know that. So let's get the ball rolling. Okay. So we get finally we get an offer out of the defense. We go back to the plaintiff. Of course, it's a non-starter. Doesn't really go anywhere, but the plaintiff comes down to 1.6. Okay. Now I got to go back in the defense camp again. What do you want to do now? And hopefully you all have been talking amongst yourself while I've been in the plaintiff's camp about what you really want to do. Well, let's get into it. Who thinks they don't have any exposure? Okay, let's talk about the denominator of the fraction. How much do you think collectively we need to settle this case? That's a very good conversation, because if we don't agree on what it collectively takes to resolve this case, then what I call the denominator of the fraction, arguing about what percentage of the pie you should be, are you 10%, 50%, a third, whatever. If we don't agree on the denominator of the fraction, how much money globally do we need to get to then the allocation almost doesn't even really matter, because if I think I need $1 million to settle this case and you only think we need $500,000, well, you're not going to bring nearly enough money to the case. Even if you put in half of 500 is 250, but if we need $1 million, right? I'm expecting you to be half of $1 million, not half of 5. Well, you're willing to acknowledge that you're going to pay 50%, but your 50% caps out at 500. Well, that has no chance of settling the case because 500 is not going to get there. We need to come up with a plan for like about $1 million, and that hopefully that's a conversation you would have had 2 or 3 or 4 weeks before with the other defendants. Because if you have reasonably intelligent lawyers with access to the same information, they should be within the range of what they think it's going to take to settle this case. It shouldn't be the case if you have 4 defendants and 2 of the defendants think the case should resolve for about $1 million and 2 think you need about 500,000. That doesn't make any sense. It doesn't make any sense. There should be some consensus as to what it's going to take. Not the shares, not the proportional liability, but just globally, how much money do we think we need to get to make the plaintiff go away? And then we're going to talk about how we get there, right? Sometimes we have to do, I've done intra-defendant loan agreements. I've done deals where the carrier essentially loaned money to the insured with the coverage position still in place, and then they went and resolved the coverage issue later. And if the carrier was right, and then it was a loan, in which case the insured had to pay it back. If it was not a loan and there was coverage, then the case was settled and there was nothing to do. But we've done some deals like that where we have to make some creative settlements with some loans or some interdefendant, deals where, okay, we have 3 carriers involved. We can't agree on who's going to pay what, but we all agree it should take about $1 million to settle this case. So let's all agree to put in, $350 each, $330 each, and get this thing resolved. And then we'll reserve among ourselves the right for equitable allocation between the parties. That's sort of the advanced class, right? You don't want to do that kind of deal, but sometimes the plaintiff's case is so bad, you got to shut it down. It doesn't make any sense to let that case continue to linger. It's just going to get worse. So if we can't reach an agreement on proportional shares, what I'm going to propose is that you just reach an agreement on what the number needs to be, and then we'll all agree to kick in equal shares with right of equitable contribution or subrogation, basically reimbursement. And we'll have a discussion about whether we're going to do that in arbitration, whether we're going to have another mediation, whether we're going to have more formal motion practice or trial. We'll talk about how we resolve the intra-defendant thing. But the first thing we do is we take the plaintiff out of the case. And that can be a very useful strategy in multi-defendant cases. All right. So that's dealing with multiple insurers and carriers. Let's shift gears now. And for the last half hour of this session, we're going to talk about mediating with the not-for-profits. And those include governmental entities, includes, for example, your community associations, your not-for-profits like your social service organizations. I did a lot of this work at the end of my career. And so I kind of got good at figuring out how to mediate these kind of cases because they're different animals. For one thing, they don't normally respond in the same way that insurance carriers or other clients do because they're not private profit-seeking entities. They don't have the same profit motive. They don't have the same risk-benefit analysis. They don't think like private companies that are in the marketplace, or even like private individuals in the marketplace. They don't think like that. They think differently. The other thing, of course, you have to be mindful of when you're dealing with not-for-profits is that you got a board. You got more than one decision maker frequently. But it could be a private board of a HOA or a condo, or the symphony board, or the government board, whatever it might be. There's a board. There's a number of people. And so when I was defending these entities, I would always get in front of them very early in the case and figure out who were the personalities in the room, who were going to be the tough cookies to sell on settlement, what were the objections, and just to float the idea of settlement generally and see who reacts to it. Figure out who the troublemakers are in the room, right? Figure out who's going to be a problem for me in the room. Some of the not-for-profits, if you're a charity, if you're the American Cancer Society, you're Goodwill, you're somebody that depends on donations, and you have volunteers, and you're that kind of a social service not-for-profit, for example, they're probably going to want to settle, particularly if they have coverage, and most times they do, because they don't want the adverse publicity, particularly if it's like a employment practices case, or it's a significant premises liability case, or bodily injury case, or something that's got a little it's a little morally turpitudinous. They're going to want to get rid of it. So oftentimes with not-for-profits, because they value their reputation in a way that's different than private actors, they're going to be pretty motivated usually to settle a case. So getting the case settled is not usually a problem. Again, these are generalities, but they're getting the idea of, bearing it, getting confidentiality has a lot of appeal to not-for-profits. So in that sense, it makes it a little easier. What makes it a whole heck of a lot harder is because sometimes they get people on the board who just don't want to settle, and they carry a lot of sway. And then you got to figure out, okay, how do I get this? Mr. Johnson's a big pain. How do I get Johnson to recognize that we're not going to litigate this case to the end? This is a bad case. They don't have necessarily they're not lawyers. They're not sophisticated people necessarily. They don't have any ability to assess litigation risk. They just have strong feelings and big personalities and big voices. Yeah, right. So that's my job, is to talk them off the ledge, and it takes time. I got to build rapport with them. I got to build trust with them. I got to learn to talk to them in a way that's respectful, right? And I got to say, there's some problems here. And one of the great things you can always do with a board, and I didn't figure this out till late in my career, I go, if you're the one, if this board doesn't settle this case and this case goes horribly wrong, you're violating, potentially, there's going to be an argument that you breach your duty as board members because you didn't minimize the exposure of the organization. And as a board member, you got a fiduciary obligation to the entity as a whole. And one of those, and part of that duty is to minimize exposure, is to minimize risk, is to protect the assets of the entity. And if you're saying, well, we're going to go to trial in this sexual harassment case because, our former president didn't do anything wrong. Well, that goes horribly wrong. I'm guessing your donor base is going to be in trouble. I'm guessing you're going to have a hard time coming up with the money to pay the judgment unless you got coverage. And even if you have coverage, you're going to get non-renewed, and then your rates are going to go up. So I can usually make arguments as to why it's a good idea to settle the case. But with HOAs and any kind of not-for-profit board or governmental entities, you want to get in there and figure out pretty quickly what's the temperature in the room. Because there's some boards that don't mind settling. They just kind of let it go. And you, Dave, we'll follow you. We'll do as you say. If you recommend it, we'll do it. Great, fine, easy. But that doesn't happen all the time. I don't want there to be surprises, and I find out I got 2 or 3 members of the board who are vehemently opposed to settlement, and I find this out the day before mediation. That is a big problem. That's bad lawyering. Your carrier's not going to be happy. The other members of the board are going to be frustrated. So the only way you get to settle cases with HOAs and boards and other not-for-profits is you got to get in there early. You got to schedule meetings with them at the beginning of the case. You got to let them ask all the questions they want to ask, and you got to be very respectful and very patient. And sometimes they're going to ask silly questions that you think are silly, and sometimes you think they're irrelevant. Sometimes sometimes they're just very unsophisticated. Well, if we settle this one, there's going to be more plaintiffs. No, that's not really going to happen, because there's almost never any copycat litigation. Now, it's helpful if you're like a 50-year-old gray-haired guy like me. Sometimes I've seen younger associates kind of get chewed up by the board. They're just a little too young to be in that. And that sounds bad, but I think it's true. Sometimes they're just a little too young to be in the room. There's too many older bodies, because a lot of times these boards are run by older folks, right? So you got to have someone that's more in their age bracket to come in there and tell them what they need to hear. Sometimes it's harder for them to hear from a 26-year-old, 4th-year associate, we're not trying this case, and here's why we're not trying this case. And they don't want to hear from that person. You got to it helps, at least for the first meeting, to have someone more senior in the room to get the board under control. If you don't have a control problem, if it's easy, your 4th-year associate runs the file, no problem. But if there's a problem and you got difficult personalities, it might be helpful to have some seasoned eyes on the problem who's more capable of dealing with some difficult actors. Okay. The other thing that can happen with not-for-profits is the board can change. The elected officials, or if it's an HOA or a condo, for example, they can change, and you got to be mindful that the willingness of the board to resolve the case can change with the personality. So sometimes you go from a highly litigious board to a board that just wants it to go away, or vice versa. You got to be mindful of that. Okay. The other thing you need to be mindful of if you're representing governmental entities is that they have political concerns about making deals. And I've had people, either the city attorney, the county attorney, whoever it is, tell me, Dave, what you're proposing makes a lot of sense, but we can't agree to it. It just won't sit with the board. It doesn't politically fly. It just doesn't pass the sniff test. We can't justify it on some other level. The money makes sense, but the deal doesn't make sense. And so they'll say, if the judge orders me to do it, I'll pay it, obviously, but I'm not going to agree to it. Right? So what are the political ramifications? Are there damage caps and there fee shifting provisions? Because government and not-for-profits particularly don't like the risk of paying somebody else's fees. They don't have that kind of risk tolerance. So are there any damage? Is there any fee shifting provisions? They also have, sometimes if you're governmental entity, you have a damage cap. So that gives them some cushion against a bad result. That's another reason why they don't necessarily have to settle, because they got the benefit of cushions. They got the benefit of caps, right? So they're not going to be facing $1 million exposure because they might be capped at 250 or whatever it is. And so they may not be that inclined to settle, and because they view themselves, governments are a little different than regular not-for-profits, because governments are governments, so they don't want to be viewed as a target. They don't want to politically roll over and pay those kind of claims. They feel like they owe the taxpayers a defense. So they're more than willing to pay for defense rather than settle the case. That can be frustrating for plaintiffs' attorneys, particularly. Suing the government's a chore. It really is. It's not always easy. So the other thing, let's switch from governmental entities. We could do an hour on that because that's just a different animal altogether. And I don't want to take up the whole time. The more common scenario for most of you probably listening to this, it's going to be folks who are representing associations, not-for-profits, either HOAs, condos in Florida, or just charitable organizations that have boards. And it's not always about money for them. Don't let one person hijack the board. That's very important. If you look like they're hijacking the board, you got to talk to some of the folks about, okay, how do we neutralize this person? How do we temper them? How do we get them to back down a little bit and see the big picture here? Make sure reporting becomes very important with not-for-profits. So if it's a big board, what they'll sometimes do is they'll create a litigation committee, and they'll have a vote that says, okay, litigation committee is Fred, Ted, June, and Steve. Okay. And they'll say, you're authorized to report to them. You don't have to copy the whole board. You can take your direction from them. That's great. And I've done that sometimes where they didn't think about it. I said, do you all want to form a litigation committee? So I just communicate with 3 or 4 people. But remember, you still owe a duty of allegiance and care to the entire organization. So if these 4 people who are on the litigation committee you think are going in the wrong direction, they're giving you bad instruction, they're giving you bad information, you say, guys, I'm not comfortable with this litigation committee anymore. We're going to have to go back and revisit this. I'm going to have to schedule a meeting of the entire board. And this is where you get into you really got to be diplomatic. You got to be really careful. You probably want to bring in your colleagues and talk about it some. This is when you get into the sort of this is the advanced class, when things start going off the rails with your not-for-profit. It can get really ugly in a hurry. I had created a document that said, what is a mediation and why is settlement wise? And I would send that out to the board. And I just created it. I just sort of talked to them about why this settlement makes sense, just to globally sort of start massaging the board members to get into the place where they're going to be amenable to a settlement. Because a lot of these policies, sometimes these policies have settlement control provisions, right? So like a D&O policy, a directors and officers liability policy from a carrier, will often have a settlement control clause. So the carrier it's not like a BI claim. It can't just go out and settle it and the insured be darned. The insured has to agree to all of the terms of the settlement. And the policy requires that the carrier get the insured's consent, right? Well, what if the deal also requires that they amend their bylaws, or they got to put up a new sign, or there's got to be some policy change, right? There can be a lot of non-economic things that's got to happen as part of the deal that the board's got to sign off on, right? Maybe they got to change, and they got a trademark problem. They got to change their logo. Maybe they got a website that's got some material on there that people are objecting to, and you got to take it down. So there could be a whole host of issues you're dealing with a not-for-profit that's different than an ordinary case. But there's a settlement control clause in the policy. And the carrier is going to expect you, if you're the insurance defense attorney, they're going to expect you to get consent. They're going to ask you, Dave, I want you to get consent. And if you can't get consent, You need to let the no carrier know that you can't, and here's why, and here's the problem. And then the carrier can go deal with it, and they can hire coverage counsel and start writing snarky letters. But if you're the defense lawyer, it's not your job. Your job is to try to get consent, but if you can't, you got to leave it alone. Say, carrier, you're going to have to do what you need to do to get the consent, because my job is not to force my client to settle. My job is to represent my client's interests. If they don't want to settle, then that's sort of where I'm at. Now, the carrier doesn't want to hear that. But that's sometimes what happens is you get these conflicts between the carrier's desire to settle for economic reasons and the not-for-profit's desire to say, I'm not going to change my bylaws. I'm not going to capitulate to this homeowner. I'm not going to do these things because it's going to set up a problem for me with other homeowners, and I don't want to do that. Right. So these are not easy cases to litigate. Do you know there's a heightened risk of malpractice when you represent not-for-profits? Yes. Yes, particularly in the HOA and condo arena in Florida. There's an increased risk of legal malpractice. And there's a couple of reasons for that. One, because you sometimes forget that there's an entire board there that you have to placate. And one or two of those folks can get upset and try to convince the others to bring a lawsuit. Second, if it goes badly, they want to have some out. And sometimes the board will blame you as the lawyer for their own bad judgment, right? Same thing happens with insurance agents, by the way. The insurance agents get sued by HOAs because the HOA doesn't buy enough in coverage, and then they have a coverage problem, and they fuss it, and the agent says, well, I told you to buy more and you didn't, and they blame the agent for the problem. So the agents and lawyers and folks who deal with HOAs and condos sometimes have increased risk of professional liability exposure because you just got to be managing that relationship. It takes more time and effort, and you got to communicate very, very clearly and carefully. It's not an easy thing to do to represent these organizations, and the will of the board can change with one election. So what can be a friendly board and a board you have control over all of a sudden becomes a ragtag group of crazies. Sometimes what happens in HOA litigation in particular is that it's because of the litigation, the board changes, right? So the community says, you guys got us in this ugly piece of litigation, so we're going to throw you all out. We're going to put in a bunch of people, and these people either don't want to settle at all, or they want to settle in the worst possible way, but you got to figure that out, right? So sometimes there's factions among the boards as to how they want to handle the case. The other thing that can happen with not-for-profits is because sometimes if the claimant is an employee, or if the claimant is a resident or an owner, there are members on the board who are sympathetic to the plaintiff's plight. Seen that happen. So they're sympathetic. They're not really interested in litigating. They're interested in paying the homeowner or capitulating to whatever the homeowner wants because they kind of agree with the homeowner. And you got to be very careful of that. So I've had a couple of cases where it was so bad that I was worried that my privileged communication was not going to be maintained as privileged. And so I had to have a very hard meeting and wrote a letter to the board and said, listen, you have a legal obligation to maintain this information as confidential. If you don't, you're breaching your fiduciary duty. If there's anybody on here who doesn't want to receive this confidential information or thinks has some connection to the plaintiff or the plaintiff's attorney that I'm not aware of, you best tell me now. You best tell me now, tell us now, because we find out later on that you were cooperating in some way that wasn't approved by us. There's going to be a lot of hard questions of potential civil liability for you. And so I have those kind of conversations. It doesn't happen all the time, but you got to find out if anybody's sympathetic to the plaintiff or the plaintiff's counsel in the case. They may have a similar claim, maybe like some HOA thing, and they're arguing about some deed restriction, and they got the same deed restriction issue. And this, is I want to build a certain kind of fence, and this plaintiff's fussing about the fence, and I want to do the same thing. So if you win, I'm going to come on your coattails, right? You have that kind of issue. Very, very difficult representing HOAs because they are, it's like a split personality, right? They got multiple people with multiple agendas, multiple ideas, and you got to figure out a way to get consensus among all those people moving forward. And your reporting's got to be pretty candid and don't shade the facts because one of the board members isn't going to like it. That's not good either. You get sometimes an exec director or the president of the board, and he wants this, he thinks or she thinks this needs to go a certain way, and they don't want to hear your noise. They don't want to hear your contrary opinion. And so you don't put the contrary opinion in the suit report. Wrong. You don't owe a duty to the individual board members. You owe a duty to the board as a whole if you're representing the HOA or the not-for-profit or whatever it might be. So it's really important. If there's coverage problems, you got to let them know right away. Hey, I'm here to defend you, but if this thing goes the way I think it's going to go, at the end of the day, the carrier might say there's no coverage for those claims. There's no indemnity for those claims. So you may need to retain separate counsel to evaluate your non-insured exposure. Those are some of the things I like to do. So I use a what is a mediation memo that goes out. Why is settlement a good thing memo go out, sort of generic kind of things I use to my not-for-profits. And then I schedule a meeting and see what kind of pushback I get. I use positions. I always encourage a position statement from the other side in advance because I want to show that to the board because it helps me get client control. So I tell the plaintiff's attorney, I said, you need to send me a position statement at least 2 weeks in advance. Tell me all the things that are wrong with my case so I can get in front of the board and get settlement authority. If I explain why I'm doing it, then the plaintiff's attorney normally will agree to do it, right? It's in your best interest, plaintiff's attorney, if you send me a pre-mediation statement, because then I have something to show the board. I don't want my suit report to be the only message that they get. I want to hear it from you. Okay, if you don't have coverage, you got to make sure you got the budget to litigate. Where's the money going to come from? If they're a HOA or they're a not-for-profit social service organization, they may be relying on a hodgepodge of state and federal grants and donations and fundraisers and all sorts of things, and they may have significant economic pressures. They don't have a budget for litigation frequently. So then you have to have a conversation. Well, why didn't somebody buy coverage? And then you have an issue about whether the agent screwed up or not, or did the board screw up in not getting coverage? That's another advanced class. But if they have financial pressures, you need to know early. You don't want to get stuck in federal court litigating a significant case on behalf of an HOA or on behalf of a not-for-profit, and then they say, well, we don't have the money for this. Well, we don't have the money to hire that expert. Well, that would have been good information a long time ago. So we got to have a very realistic conversation about the budget. And you should never have a rosy budget. You should never have an optimistic budget. You should always have a pessimistic budget with HOAs and condos and not-for-profits because it doesn't hurt if you're under budget. But if you go over budget, then they're going to have a whole lot of hard questions for you, and then they're going to talk about sacking you. I mean, the thing I see as a mediator is I see not-for-profits, and they've gone through 2 or 3 lawyers already because they didn't like the message they were being told, or they were operating on a shoestring and the lawyer was tired of, running big ARs. And then I know that's going to be a problem. I know that's going to be a huge problem. I've seen 2 or 3 different lawyers on the file. That means someone's given them some advice they didn't want to hear, right? Or someone sent them a bill they didn't want to pay. So those sorts of organizations are for sure a challenge. In a couple cases I've had, I saw my suit report end up in the plaintiff's attorney's document response back to me. So what had happened was I had prepared a suit report. A board member received it. The board member sent it to the plaintiff's attorney, or the plaintiff, probably the plaintiff because they were friends. And the plaintiff gave it to his lawyer. So now the lawyer has my suit report. Now, the lawyer is supposed to, if he knows he has it, he's supposed to call me and tell me he got privileged communication. There's ethical rules on that. One case I had, he didn't know he had it, and because he just had a big bucket of documents from his client he hadn't gone through. He just made them available for reading. So I was in his room and I go, whoa, why is there a letter from me in your production? And then that spirals into a whole big conversation. And then I got to go back to the board and I got to figure out who the rat is. There's a rat in the woodpile that's reporting this information. And then we form a litigation committee and we tighten the ship up and we figure out that that's not going to happen. Unfortunately, it wasn't the kind of suit report that was, super incriminating because we had a good case. So I didn't think we had much exposure. So my suit report said we don't have much exposure, which was fine for the plaintiff to see if he even read it. I'm not sure he actually did. But it was kind of an awkward situation when my document ended up in his production, his document production. These things can happen with HOAs because you're dealing with some unsophisticated people, some not-for-profits. Sometimes they're unsophisticated, sometimes they're sympathetic, and they don't really care about the nuances of the attorney-client relationship and their fiduciary duty to the HOA and this sort of thing. So that's a little bit about not-for-profits. the litigation committee thing is a good thing to use. Even if a board of any size, you don't want to have to report to 16 different people and field questions from 16 different actors. So the other thing I would do is I was always schedule a phone call, like a dial-in phone call meeting, like about once a month if I had a significant piece of litigation. And I'd say, hey, there's a phone call meeting here. If you have any questions about what's going on, I'm gonna say a few things. And then if you're on the phone call, I can answer all your questions. And they like that a lot because it gives them a time and a place. I don't want to have 16 different or 13 different conversations and 13 different phone calls. And so it's just easier for me and for them to know, oh, okay, Friday, Friday at 9 o'clock in the morning, Henry's going to have a phone call. We can, if you have any questions in advance, send them to me and I'll get, be prepared to answer them. And that was also another good thing was I'd say, I send an email on Monday saying we're having a phone call on Friday. If you can't make it, let me know, but I'll answer your questions in writing if I can, or I'll answer them during the phone call. And that's another good way of currying favor with the board. And so the board views you as a decent fellow or lady that they can trust and they have confidence in. The other thing you have to do with not-for-profits, it's really important that you explain the tripartite relationship, because for a lot of these folks, they're not litigation savvy. So when they see that you show up and you've been paid by the carrier, your carrier's providing a defense, they think you work for the insurance company. They think that you are essentially with the insurance company or aligned with the insurance company. And so you need to have that conversation with them very quickly and say, listen, I'm the same as your other lawyer, the lawyer that does all your transactional stuff and does your bylaw meeting minutes and all that hoo-ha. I'm the same as that person, only my bills are paid by the insurance company. I owe the same duty of loyalty and care as that person does. I'm going to act in the same way. It's just my bills are going to get paid by the carrier. So whatever you would tell them, you can tell me. It doesn't, and I won't ever tell anything to the insurance company that would prejudice your claims vis-a-vis the insurance company. So if you told me that you lied on your insurance application, for example, I couldn't tell that to the carrier because that's a client confidence. So I can't disclose any client confidences that would prejudice you in the eyes of the insurance company. I tell them that at the beginning of the relationship, which is true in every tripartite relationship, but I spend a little extra time at the beginning of the relationship explaining this tripartite thing because it just seems like it makes sense to me to do that because I'm dealing with folks who aren't necessarily litigation savvy, or they're not even necessarily business people. They might just be retirees or whatever. So I gotta educate them a little bit for my own protection and for theirs, so they really understand what my role is. Because they think a lot of times I'm just with the insurance company effectively, and I'm not. I'm going to act independently. Okay. Some D&O policies have very broad coverage provisions that will even cover like fraud and criminal wrongdoing up until the time of the conviction or up until the time of the judgment. So that's another interesting thing about this kind of work is you can get some really funky allegations. You think, well, there wouldn't be any coverage for that. Well, there is. So sometimes you're defending some complaints that got some really salacious allegations in them. And that's okay because the policies will sometimes provide a defense for those. They just won't provide any indemnity. And again, that's one of the things you have to explain to your policyholder. You're being sued for fraud, or you're being sued for intentional misconduct, some kind of a statutory violation or something. But it's covered only up until the time of the judgment. If the judgment goes the wrong way on those counts, there won't be any indemnity for those claims. And so hopefully there's a reservation of rights letter from the carrier that explains that. But it would be a good idea for you, the defense lawyer, to make sure you're cognizant of what the carrier's coverage provisions and coverage positions are so that you can counsel them accordingly. Because they think, well, if you're covering those defenses, then you're going to pay any judgment. Not necessarily the case. So that's helpful. So what are your to-do items when you're representing not-for-profits? Get to the board early. Find out who the folks are who are going to be the detractors, the objectors, the difficult actors. Figure out who those folks are. If the board changes in a material way because of an election or turnover, got to get with the new board and have those same conversations again. Use a special litigation committee to funnel the communication and channel the communication so you know where you need to go in terms of your communication, your phone calls, and your letters. And be mindful of the fact that they have sometimes consent to settlement provisions in their policies, or if they're a government agency, they don't think like private actors in terms of their exposure because they're the government. So they may not have a political appetite for a lot of the deals that are out there, and they'd rather try it and lose than have to pay that settlement. That sometimes happens. And then be mindful of the caps and the other defenses that government agencies might have that private actors wouldn't necessarily have. So reporting becomes pretty important. Meeting with the board in advance becomes pretty important, and getting the plaintiff's attorney to send a position statement in advance of mediation is something that you can use to your benefit to educate the other side on what the problems are in the case, if there are any. So that's a little quick primer on mediating with the not-for-profits and the governmental entities and the HOAs. I hope you enjoyed it. The next program is going to be a week from today on the 20th. We're moving the time from, I think it's scheduled for 11:30. We're going to move that to 4 o'clock. If you haven't seen the other sections, parts 1 through 6, I heartily encourage you to go back and check those out. And I think it makes for a nice, complete sort of soup to nuts 360-degree view of the mediation process when you pick up those earlier seminars. So hope you enjoyed it. Thanks very much. And the Florida Bar number is posted there in the chat. It's also available on my website, henryadr.com. And there'll be new videos coming online pretty much every month, every couple of weeks into the foreseeable future. So hopefully that will provide you with some additional CLE down the road. It's always free. So thanks very much. Take care. And we're going to end the recording now. Thanks.